Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest and most unsettling truths from Victorian England. A time when divorce was nearly impossible, but selling your wife in a public market was somehow allowed. It happened more often than you think. In towns, in taverns, in front of quiet crowds. And for many women, it was the only way out of a marriage they could never legally escape. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always quietly powerful to see how far these stories reach. If you find value in these slow, forgotten histories, feel free to subscribe. You're always welcome here. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise. And let's begin. You're standing in a muddy village square. There's a rope in your hand. And you're about to be sold. There are certain kinds of silence that do not arrive suddenly. They build. They stretch across years, slipping beneath floorboards, folding into pillowcases, hiding behind lowered gazes and unopened letters. In Victorian England, the silence inside many homes was this kind, not peaceful, but heavy. Not restful, but resigned. It was the silence of a woman who could not leave. And a man who did not need to. There were wives in the 1800s who went years without laughter. Without affection. Without even the dignity of being acknowledged. Their marriages were not filled with violence that could be proven or cruelty that could be named. They were simply unlivable. But leaving was not an option. The law didn't care if a woman was unhappy. The law didn't care if she had been ignored, disrespected, used, or erased. And so the home became a trap, beautifully wallpapered in some cases, but a trap all the same. The law said she belonged to him. Her wages, if she earned them, were his. Her body, her children, her name, her future, all his. Divorce technically did exist. But only in the same way a distant mountain exists, visible in theory, unreachable in practice. In England before the late 1800s, a full legal divorce could only be granted by Parliament itself. The cost? Equivalent to several years' wages for the average man, and utterly unimaginable for most women. For the wealthy, scandals made headlines. Adultery, affairs, even violent abuse were dissected in courtrooms, published in papers, whispered about over tea. But for the poor, for the forgotten, no such spectacle was available. If your husband drank away the rent, or ignored you, or took mistresses, or humiliated you, well, you endured. Or you fled. And if you fled, you lost everything. Many women stayed because they had children. Others stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Some stayed because they had been taught since birth that marriage was sacred, and suffering was noble. But a few found another way out. And that way was not hidden in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It was out in the open. In public squares. In cattle markets. Under gray skies and jeering crowds. Wife selling. Not a metaphor. Not a myth. But an actual ritual, part street performance, part social transaction, and entirely ungoverned by the law. The earliest cases date back to the late 17th century, but by the time the 1800s arrived, it had become something else. Not quite legal. Not quite illegal. Just accepted. The courts looked the other way. The clergy disapproved, but rarely intervened. And the people? They watched. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they even cheered. It's difficult, from the comfort of the present, to understand how such a thing could happen. But it begins with something simpler than cruelty. It begins with despair. Imagine a man, tired, bitter, humiliated by poverty. His marriage no longer serves him. He cannot afford a divorce, and even if he could, the law would not allow it unless his wife had committed adultery. But there is a loophole. A strange, unspoken understanding that if he sells her publicly, if he goes through the performance properly, it will be recognized, even honored, as a kind of separation. And so he does. He leads her to market. Not dragging, that would be frowned upon. But walking beside her, often with a rope tied lightly around her wrist, shoulder, or waist. The rope, they said, was necessary. It symbolized livestock. It framed the act not as a betrayal of marriage, but as a transaction of property. After all, how else could the crowd understand what was happening? There would be ale. There would be bargaining. Sometimes there would be a lover waiting, the woman's true choice, ready to buy her from her husband in a bizarre imitation of chivalry. Other times, the woman had no idea who the buyer would be. She stood silently, in her apron or shawl, pretending not to hear the jeers. Pretending not to care. We have court records, letters, and news clippings that describe these sales in haunting detail. Some were cordial, even celebratory. The wife smiled. The husband drank. The new man took her hand gently and led her home. But others were cruel. The crowd grew restless. The woman wept. The buyer was a stranger. And the rope never came off. What's most unsettling is how ordinary it all became. For nearly a century, in towns across England, this practice went unpunished. It was spoken of in newspapers with a kind of amused detachment. Another wife sold. One headline reads, "For 2 shillings and a quart of ale." No outrage. No inquiry. Just routine. For women, the choice was bleak: endure an unbearable marriage, or agree to a sale that reduced you to property. But for some, the sale was a kind of liberation. A strange, bitter freedom that gave them, for the first time, a say. Not in the transaction itself, perhaps, but in the outcome. Some women orchestrated their own sales, whispering plans to neighbors, agreeing in secret with a lover, ensuring the rope was just for show. Even so, they were not free. Not really. Because no matter how carefully it was arranged, no matter how gently the rope was tied, the world around them still saw them as something to be transferred. And dignity, once sold, is not so easily recovered. It is tempting to think these stories are rare. Exceptions. Anomalies. But the records suggest otherwise. From Yorkshire to Somerset, from rural villages to bustling towns, wife sales occurred with shocking regularity. They were not always public spectacles. Sometimes they happened behind barns. Sometimes in taverns. Sometimes the only witness was the barkeep. And then there were the children, standing beside their mother, watching as strangers haggled over her worth. Watching as laughter erupted after a final bid. Those children would grow up knowing that marriage could end in rope, not love. In sale, not sorrow. And that silence, that quiet resignation, would pass from one generation to the next. As the years wore on, protests did emerge. The newspapers began to shift their tone. Clergy spoke out more forcefully. The courts, reluctantly, began to frown upon the practice. But even then, there was no formal law passed to ban it outright. It faded not by legislation, but by shame. By modernity. By the growing discomfort of a culture slowly waking up to its own absurdity. But the silence remained. Not just in legal documents, but in family histories. Few women who were sold ever spoke of it again. Few families passed the stories down. And yet, in the margins of old letters and the corners of yellowed newspapers, the traces are still there. Quiet. Waiting. Just beneath the surface. It is there that we begin, not with outrage, but with a whisper. A whisper of lives unlived, of voices stifled, of exits forged not in freedom, but in desperation. This was a time when divorce was impossible. But public wife auctions, those were somehow allowed. Before we can understand how a society allowed something as unsettling as wife auctions, we must first understand what it meant to be married in Victorian England, not in ceremony, but in law. Today, we think of marriage as a partnership. It is not always equal, but it is at least recognized as a joining of two people with shared rights. In the 1800s, this was not the case. A woman, upon marrying, was legally absorbed into her husband. Her legal identity was no longer her own. This was the principle of coverture, an old English legal doctrine that declared that a husband and wife were one person in law, and that person was the husband. The wife's separate existence, legally speaking, disappeared. She could not own property, sign contracts, or earn money in her own name. She had no legal rights to her own children. Her very body was considered under her husband's control. This was not some obscure technicality. It was the everyday reality of millions of women, and it was understood as natural, even moral. A husband was the head of the household. A wife was expected to obey. Love was never required. Protection was promised, but not guaranteed. And if that promise failed, if the husband was cruel, or absent, or dangerous, the law still offered no real remedy. Theoretically, divorce existed. But it was not a right. It was a privilege reserved for the rich, the powerful, or the well-connected. Until 1857, the only way to obtain a full legal divorce in England was by passing a private Act of Parliament. This was costly, time-consuming, and public. Very few even attempted it. And those who did were usually men. Even after reforms arrived, they came slowly, and never fast enough. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 allowed ordinary people to file for divorce in civil court, but it was still deeply unequal. A man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A woman, on the other hand, had to prove adultery and another offense: cruelty, desertion, incest, or bigamy. The burden of proof was higher. The risk of social ruin greater. And for the poorest classes, those most vulnerable to bad marriages and economic hardship, even civil divorce remained largely out of reach. It cost money. It required evidence. It demanded a process that most could not afford, legally or emotionally. Which meant, for all practical purposes, the vast majority of women in England during the 18th and 19th centuries had no lawful exit from marriage. This legal deadlock created strange moral contradictions. A man could abuse his wife and still retain full custody of their children. A woman could be abandoned by her husband for years and still be forbidden from remarrying, because she was still considered his, under the law. A wife could run from a dangerous home, but she could not take her children with her. Doing so would be kidnapping. The courts were not blind to this injustice. But the culture was slow to shift. Judges upheld precedent. Parliament hesitated to interfere in the private affairs of families. Clergy reminded women that suffering was holy. And newspapers, when they did report on marriage breakdowns, often painted the women as hysterical, ungrateful, or wayward. There were stories of women who begged to be heard, who wrote letters to editors, to members of Parliament, to local magistrates. Women who described not just violence, but despair, the kind that sets in when every door is locked, every right denied. Some women fled, only to be dragged back by the law. Others were imprisoned for leaving, accused of abandonment, theft, or moral decay. And through all of this, the one thing a woman could not do, legally or culturally, was start over. She could not choose to leave. She could not remarry. She could not erase the man who claimed her. In some cases, he had disappeared entirely, fled to another county, or another continent. But as long as he lived, and she was still his wife by law, she was stuck, frozen in place, unable to build a new life. This trap bred desperation. Not always loud. Not always visible. Sometimes it looked like illness. Sometimes like silence. Sometimes like quiet rage pressed into each corner of the home. But in a few cases, and only in the most fragile, exposed communities, that desperation took shape in public. It wore a rope around the waist. It walked through the market. It pretended to laugh. It is important to understand, wife selling was not a substitute for divorce. It was not legally recognized. It was not approved by statute. But in a world where divorce was nearly impossible, it became, for some, the only available path. A performative gesture, wrapped in shame and absurdity, that served as a kind of social annulment. Once a woman had been sold, the community treated her as separated. Her husband no longer claimed her. The man who bought her was often accepted as her new partner. The law looked away. Sometimes it intervened, mostly when the ritual turned violent. But often, it simply ignored what had happened. A legal fiction was quietly upheld, no paperwork, no records, but a change in reality nonetheless. It was, in effect, a loophole powered by collective silence. Historians debate how widespread the practice truly was. Some suggest it was rare. Others argue it was underreported. But all agree that it reflected something deeper, a legal system so rigid, so blind to human suffering, that people invented their own exit. And when that exit required humiliation, so be it. When it required pretending a woman was property, the crowds still gathered. One might ask, why didn't the law change sooner? The answer lies partly in class. The lawmakers, wealthy, male, insulated, did not see the lives of working-class women as urgent. They saw wife selling as vulgar, yes, but unimportant. A strange curiosity of rural life. Not a crisis. Not a sign of legal failure. But for the women who lived it, it was everything. The rope was not symbolic. It was real. The crowd was not imagined. It surrounded them. And the law, in its silence, confirmed the worst fear, that her body, her dignity, her future, were never fully hers to begin with. And so, before we continue to the stories, the markets, the men, the ropes and coins and public shame, we must hold on to this truth. The law did not fail these women because it was weak. It failed because it was never built to protect them in the first place. What followed, the auctions, the sales, the whispered deals, did not happen in a lawless vacuum. They happened inside a system that left women nowhere else to go. It rarely begins with malice. Most rituals, even the strange ones, are born not from cruelty, but from necessity, warped, awkward necessity. And the custom of selling a wife was no different. It emerged slowly, awkwardly, like a rumor that turned into a habit. And then, somehow, into a solution. In the tightly wound world of rural Victorian life, options were few, especially for the poor. Marriage was not a sentimental arrangement, it was survival. Two people, often ill-matched, bound themselves together in the hope of building a life, or at least enduring one. But when the burden became unbearable, the consequences of separation, socially, financially, legally, were devastating. And so, out of this legal chokehold, a loophole began to take shape. It had no official name, no formal blessing, but it was understood. If a man could not divorce his wife, but also could not live with her, he could take her to market. There, in public, before the eyes of his neighbors, he could offer her up, not in shame necessarily, but in symbolism. The act itself was performative, theatrical, and oddly structured. To the modern mind, this sounds unthinkable. But in the harsh economies of the time, both emotional and financial, this loophole functioned like a pressure valve. A man, worn down by disappointment or debt or bitterness, could stage his withdrawal from the marriage by pretending to sell what was, legally speaking, already considered his property. But where did it begin? Historians trace the earliest accounts of wife sales to the late 17th century, with scattered references in local records and anecdotal village reports. Yet it wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that the practice took a more recognizable shape. The ritual, such as it was, began to repeat itself: the rope, the crowd, the price, the ale. Some suggest that the origins may lie in the cattle markets themselves. These were familiar places, where transactions were visible, and symbols mattered. To sell a cow, one displayed it with a rope. A similar image, however disturbing, signaled a sale. It turned a human departure into something the town could read and accept. In these small communities, social cohesion mattered. Everyone knew everyone. A woman leaving her husband in secret would be viewed as dishonorable. But if the separation took place publicly, with coins exchanged, heads nodded, and a general show of ritualized approval, then no one had to pretend it hadn't happened. The community became the witness, the priest, and the judge. In this sense, wife-selling was not just a legal workaround, but a social one. It allowed all parties, the man, the woman, and the observers, to avoid the deeper question: why did the marriage fail? Whose fault was it? What did it mean about the culture itself? The performances varied. In some cases, the husband would speak solemnly. He would say he no longer wished to be responsible for her, that she was free to go. provided another man would take her. Other times it was cruder. Shouting, laughter, even bidding wars. Children sometimes watched. Ale was often involved. The rope was central. It was tied around the woman's arm, waist, or neck, not tightly, but visibly. It was the key symbol. Without the rope, the act might be mistaken for something else, a quarrel, a joke, a scandal. With the rope, the intention was clear. This was a transaction. Of course, legally, it meant nothing. No court would accept such a sale as binding. No document was signed. And yet, the strange power of social consensus gave it weight. After the sale, the husband rarely reclaimed his wife. The new man, the buyer, was often accepted as her partner. The old marriage, though never annulled, was left behind. There is a deep discomfort in this, the way illegality and acceptability blurred. The practice was not sanctioned by law, but it was tolerated. Judges occasionally commented on it. Magistrates sometimes fined participants for disorderly conduct. But rarely was anyone punished specifically for the sale itself. This tolerance is telling. It reveals how little the legal system wished to involve itself in the domestic struggles of the poor. It reveals, too, how community rituals often carried more weight than law. If everyone agreed that the wife had been transferred, then she had. The paperwork never mattered. And not all wife sales were humiliating. Some were carefully arranged. A woman might be in love with another man, and the husband, tired or indifferent, might agree to let her go, provided it was done properly. The performance was staged, the buyer named in advance. In these cases, the woman sometimes wore her best dress. She smiled. She played her part. But even in these gentler cases, the symbolism remained disturbing. She was property being handed over. She had no legal say, only social permission. And the crowd, no matter how polite, was still watching a deeply intimate moment unfold as if it were a market exchange. There are letters, rare, quiet, in which women speak of these sales. Some express relief. Others shame. A few describe the event as a kind of liberation, even if it came at the cost of public dignity. What unites them is the sense of improvisation. These were women making do, rewriting their futures in the only language the law would tolerate: silence and performance. It is tempting to think of this as a fringe ritual, a curiosity of the past. But its endurance, over a century, suggests otherwise. Something in the structure of Victorian society allowed it to survive. Something about the tightness of marriage, the narrowness of women's choices, the cruelty of legal delay, made this not just imaginable, but viable. And so the loophole grew. It moved from town to town, whispered through generations, joked about in taverns. Sometimes serious. Sometimes farcical. But always, at its root, was one inescapable fact. When the law traps you, you begin to invent doors. In that invention, dignity was often lost. But escape, however imperfect, still mattered. The rope might humiliate. The crowd might jeer. But for the woman who could not leave by law, this was an exit, strange, symbolic, and stitched together by silence. It usually happened on market day. The square would already be alive, hooves clapping the stones, stall-keepers shouting over turnips and tinware, children slipping between legs with pockets full of bread crusts. Amid this ordinary noise, a small commotion would form. Nothing loud. Nothing planned. Just a space opening in the crowd, as if the village itself made room for what it knew was coming. At the center stood a man. He was not always drunk, but often had ale on his breath. His shoulders were slumped, not from shame, but from weariness. In his hand, a rope. And at the end of it, a woman, tied by the waist, the wrist, or sometimes gently by a loop around her neck. She did not resist. She did not speak. Her face held that blank expression known only to the shamed and the resigned. The rope was not for force. It was for symbol. In the language of the market, rope meant ownership. Animals were led with it, and so were goods of value. A woman on a rope in public was not being punished. She was being offered. And the crowd understood that. They understood what it meant without explanation. Sometimes, a man would bring a stool or a crate and have his wife stand on it. Other times, she remained beside him, eyes down, apron clean, fingers folded over one another like prayer. The couple might be dressed for the occasion, not in finery, but in a neatness that suggested this was not chaos. It was process. It was order, of a kind. Ale was usually nearby. A mug for the seller, sometimes one for the buyer. A witness might hold it. The barkeep would lean from his door. Laughter floated above the scene, not cruel but casual, as if the absurdity of the act had worn off long ago. For some, this was just part of the rhythm of village life. Not every sale included bidding. Sometimes, the buyer had been chosen long before the rope was tied. He stood off to the side, pretending at detachment, waiting for the nod. In other cases, there truly was a transaction. A few coins exchanged. A sheep. A pig. Or, in one reported case, a quart of ale and a promise never to return. And yet, through all this, it was not theater. It was real. As real as law would allow. When the rope changed hands, it was understood, by the seller, the buyer, and the watching village, that the woman's allegiance had shifted. Her former husband no longer bore responsibility for her debts, her behavior, her children. And the new man, well, he was now the one expected to keep her. There were rules, though unspoken. The woman could not be dragged. That was considered bad form. She could not be too young, or too obviously pregnant by another man. There had to be a kind of mutual quiet. If she cried too loudly, or resisted too strongly, the illusion would break. And the crowd did not like broken illusions. In many cases, the wife being sold had already agreed. Not happily, there was rarely joy in it, but with a dull resolve that this was better than staying. She might have a lover, someone waiting to bid, someone who promised kindness. Or she might have simply given up, stepping into whatever future waited on the far side of the transaction. Sometimes, no one bid. The man shouted, cursed, offered her for a penny. The crowd shifted awkwardly. And then the rope was pulled back, the wife led away, unsold. No law was broken, and yet something in the air felt disturbed, like a ritual half completed, a spell cast but not received. Local papers covered such events sparingly, and always with a touch of amused detachment. Wife sold at Tiverton, read one. Exchange for a dog and an empty jug. The writing was never angry. It was anecdote, local color, a kind of moral curiosity at the edges of law. But for the woman, there was nothing amusing in it. Even when she agreed, even when she smiled, even when the sale was staged like a dance, the crowd still watched. The rope was still real. Her name, in whispers, was no longer hers. She was the one who was sold. And that label lingered longer than any marriage vow. Children often watched, especially in small villages where privacy was a luxury. They sat near their mothers or ran past with a glance, absorbing the scene without fully grasping it. But the lesson etched itself into their minds: a wife could be given away. A husband could declare himself done. Marriage, though blessed in church, could end in the marketplace. Not all scenes were quiet. In some, the wife protested. She might shout, or strike the man trying to claim her. These moments turned ugly quickly. The crowd tensed. The men laughed louder. Someone might step in, not to stop the sale, but to restore its order. Shame was permitted. Disorder was not. And then there were those whose sales were almost ceremonial. A husband, weary but kind, letting go of a wife he could not keep. A buyer, decent and sober, offering a home. The rope passed hands and there were nods. The woman was untied, walked away, and no one mocked her. These scenes were rare. But they are there, buried in letters, folded into oral histories. What makes the practice so haunting is not just the act itself, but the world that allowed it to continue, the silence of law, the shrug of society, the ease with which indignity was accepted if it solved a problem. The rope was not just a rope. It was a symbol of everything the law refused to see: broken marriages, desperate women, the failure of justice dressed as tradition. Over time, the ritual evolved. Some towns began to frown upon it. The papers grew more critical. Clergy condemned it. But it never vanished all at once. It faded like smoke, slipping between eras. Even as laws changed, the memory lingered. In some villages, it became a story told in hushed tones. In others, a joke. But for the women who had stood with rope around them, it was never funny. In the end, it was not the sale itself that mattered. It was the quietness with which it happened, the nods, the coins, the turning away. A society that could not imagine giving women freedom through law had somehow invented a public spectacle to take it from them politely. And so, on market day, amid the apples and boots and wool, a woman might stand. The ropes soft but visible. The crowd still. The ale poured. And somewhere in the silence, a bell rang. Not for the sale, but for the fact that, in this village, this was how freedom looked. History often focuses on the participants. The man who held the rope. The woman who wore it. The buyer, waiting quietly or smugly in the wings. But just beyond the center of the market, lining the cobbles and leaning against carts, stood another group, the crowd. Not just passers-by, but witnesses. Not just witnesses, but enablers. They watched. And they allowed it to happen. The crowd was never officially summoned. There were no posters, no town criers declaring a sale. But word traveled quickly in small towns, especially when something strange was about to happen. A whisper at the blacksmith's, a nudge at the pub, a murmur between stalls. There's to be a sale today. And so they came. Some watched out of curiosity. Others came for laughter, the same way one might attend a street performance. It was a diversion. A strange show that, while grim, still fit within the rough humor of the time. In taverns, men told stories of the funniest sales they'd seen. Of wives who cracked jokes. Of husbands who haggled. Of buyers who changed their minds halfway through. The tone was always flippant, not cruel, but casual. This was important, because in that casualness lay a kind of moral insulation. If it was treated as a joke, it didn't have to be taken seriously. If it made people laugh, then no one had to look too closely at the woman with the rope around her waist. But there were also those who didn't laugh. Elderly women who watched with tightened lips. Teenagers who stared too long. Children who asked quiet questions. And men, not many, but some, who shifted uncomfortably, torn between the pull of tradition and the stinging awareness that something was wrong. These crowds played a strange role. They were not passive. Their presence granted permission. If no one gathered, the sale lost its meaning. It became merely two people on a street. But with a crowd, the ritual gained form. The crowd was witness, chorus, judge. It was the crowd that decided if the performance had succeeded. If the rope had done its work. And the crowd remembered. In a small town, the story of a wife's sale was not forgotten. It was added to the quiet folklore of the place. She was the one sold outside the Red Lion Inn. That boy? His mother went for 3 pence and a loaf of rye. The crowd passed the story on, gave it shape, gave it endurance. There was, in some places, a kind of etiquette. You did not jeer too loudly. You did not interfere unless things turned violent. You brought your own ale. You kept your hands to yourself. And you never, never, looked too long into the eyes of the woman being sold. Because in that glance, the ritual stopped being funny. Not all crowds were unruly. Some were quiet, subdued, almost reverent in their stillness. These sales felt like funerals. Not of lives, but of options. The woman did not cry. The man did not gloat. The rope was passed, and the people parted silently. These were the sales that haunted most. Because they offered no drama, only resignation. But there were also cruel crowds. Especially in larger towns, or on festival days when ale was cheap and tempers high. There, the sale could become sport. The woman might be mocked. Called names. Touched. Thrown coins like she were part of a game. These sales often ended badly, with someone arrested for disorder or worse, with no one arrested at all. And then there were the silent bystanders. Those who saw and turned away. Shopkeepers who kept their eyes on the grain sacks. Bakers who dusted flour furiously. Parents who pulled children along without explanation. Their silence was not approval, but it was not resistance either. It was the kind of silence that protects order by allowing harm. Sometimes, the crowd included the woman's family. A brother who couldn't stop it. A sister who came to say goodbye. A mother standing behind a stall, her hands trembling as she weighed butter. Family did not intervene. They rarely did. Intervention would mean disorder. And disorder meant consequences. We must also ask, what did the crowd believe they were seeing? A punishment? A comedy? A farewell? A woman's shame or a man's failure? The answer, perhaps, depends on the watcher. But one truth runs through it all. The crowd made the event real. Without them, the sale held no meaning. Even the courts, when they did comment, noted the role of the crowd. A judge in one case remarked that such sales were only made effective by the acceptance of the community. That is, the law did not endorse wife selling, but society did. Quietly. Collectively. Through the gaze of the crowd. And that gaze was powerful. It shaped memory. For the woman being sold, the crowd lived on in her mind long after the rope was untied. Their laughter, or their silence, or their turned backs, all became part of the sale itself. It wasn't just the buyer she remembered. It was them. All of them. As time went on and public tolerance for the ritual faded, it was not the law that stopped wife sales first. It was the crowd. They stopped gathering. Or they gathered in smaller numbers, more shamefaced, less enthusiastic. Without witnesses, the ritual lost weight. It faded not because it was outlawed, but because the crowd no longer approved. But memory lingers. In the minds of those who saw it as children, the wife sale never truly disappeared. It became a story told in half sentences. A joke wrapped in unease. A lesson no one wanted to admit they'd learned. In that sense, the crowd lived on, not in streets, but in memory. And so when we think of wife selling, we must not only picture the man with the rope or the woman beside him. We must picture the faces beyond them, the ones that watched, and laughed, and turned away. Because history is not only shaped by its participants. It is shaped by its witnesses, too. It would be comforting, perhaps, to think that wife selling continued only because no one in power noticed. That the magistrates, lawmakers, and judges were too far removed, too distant from the cobbled market squares and smoky alehouses where such things took place. But the truth is more unsettling. The law saw. It knew. And it looked away. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, local officials were not unaware of the practice. Court cases document the moments when wife sales spilled into disorder, when a fight broke out, when someone complained, when a sale was especially public or especially cruel. In these moments, authorities were forced to act. Not to punish the sale, but to restore public order. The language used in court records is telling. Phrases like, disturbing the peace, drunken behavior, or public indecency, appear more frequently than any direct charge relating to the sale itself. The ritual was never officially sanctioned, yet it was rarely directly condemned. It lived in a gray space, between tolerated spectacle and inconvenient embarrassment. One might wonder, why didn't lawmakers put a stop to it? Why wasn't there a law passed, a declaration made, a statute enforced to prevent women from being sold like livestock in public squares? The answer lies not in the absence of law, but in its priorities. Victorian legal structures were slow, cautious, and deeply invested in property, and in this system, women were still often treated as property. Marriage laws prioritized control. They protected inheritance, legitimacy, and social order. A wife was expected to belong to her husband. And if he chose to relinquish that claim, even in a bizarre, unofficial ritual, the law had little interest in interfering. As long as no property was stolen, no violence committed, and no official marriage license altered, the courts were content to remain uninvolved. There is a cruelty in that silence. Not active harm, but something more insidious: indifference. For the women who stood at the center of the rope, the law's refusal to intervene sent a message louder than any statute. You do not matter enough. Your dignity is not worth defending. This is not a problem the state feels compelled to solve. Occasionally, judges did speak out. In one early 19th century case, a magistrate called the sale a disgrace to civilization. In another, a buyer was fined for attempting to impersonate a lawful husband. But these statements were exceptions, not rules. More often, the legal response was a shrug, a quiet note in the margin, a sigh. And sometimes, the law's silence was strategic. Wife selling, while humiliating, offered a social outlet for poor couples trapped in unbearable marriages. By not prosecuting the act itself, officials avoided making things worse, avoided flooding the courts with disputes, avoided taking responsibility for the structural injustices of divorce law. It was, in effect, an unofficial policy of non-interference. Let them do as they must. Let the villages police their own. Let the shame of the market do the work the courts refuse to do. Better, perhaps, to let a woman go publicly than to trap her indefinitely. Better, too, for the state to wash its hands of it all. There were layers to this silence. Religious authorities occasionally condemned the practice, reminding the public that marriage was sacred and could not be undone by coins and rope. But even these condemnations often stopped short of action. A sermon, perhaps. A disapproving article in the church circular. Then nothing. And so the practice survived, not because it was hidden, but because it was visible and ignored. Like so many quiet cruelties in history, it endured not through secrecy, but through collective complicity. The law did not have to condone wife-selling. It only had to leave space for it. And it did. For women, this silence was devastating. The law's refusal to acknowledge their suffering confirmed their invisibility. If a man sold a cow improperly, there might be fines. If he sold his wife, the law might frown, but would rarely intervene. And so, wives were left in a peculiar legal limbo, married in court, sold in market, recognized in either place as free. Letters from the time reflect this confusion. One woman, writing to a local MP, asked, "If I am no longer in his home, nor his care, and he has given me to another, am I still his wife?" The answer, legally, was yes. But in practice, she was something else, unmoored, uncertain, socially reclassified but still legally trapped. There is a deep emotional cost to that kind of ambiguity. It fractures identity. A woman might live with a new partner, raise children, build a home, and yet still fear that her husband might return, demand her back, or use the law to punish her. In some cases they did, and the courts upheld their claims. Some magistrates, quietly sympathetic, tried to protect these women by refusing to hear claims from former husbands who had sold their wives. But this was discretion, not policy. It depended on the mood of the court, the politics of the town, the character of the judge. There was no guarantee of mercy. In this way, wife-selling exposed the limitations of Victorian law. It revealed a system more invested in maintaining appearances than addressing suffering. A system where dignity was optional, but property was sacred. And where women, though often revered in poetry and moral literature, were not protected in practice. Over time, the growing discomfort with the practice began to show. Reformers, both legal and religious, began to speak more forcefully. Newspapers stopped treating sales as amusing anecdotes. Parliament debated new family laws. Divorce laws slowly expanded. And with these shifts, the custom of wife-selling began to recede. But even as it faded, the law never formally acknowledged its role. No great statute was passed to outlaw the practice. No apology issued. It disappeared not with a ban, but with a sigh. The culture changed, and the law followed, slowly, reluctantly, without reflection. And so we are left with a strange legacy, a practice that lived in public, performed before crowds, covered in print, and yet officially, legally, was never supposed to exist. It is a history not of bold injustice, but of quiet avoidance. Not of cruelty, but of neglect. In the silence of the courts, in the shrugs of magistrates, In the downcast eyes of lawmakers, we see a deeper truth. Sometimes, what the law refuses to name becomes its own kind of violence. And for the women who wore the rope, that silence was louder than any gavel. She stood in the square, hands folded before her. The rope itched around her wrist, but she did not move. All around her, boots clacked over cobblestones. A boy shouted near the bakery. Somewhere nearby, someone was laughing, not at her, not yet, but soon. She was not afraid. She was not brave. She was something else entirely, exhausted. And she was ready to go. We speak so often of the men in these stories, the sellers, the buyers, the crowds that watched. But rarely do we stop to ask, who were the women at the center of it all? What did they feel, what did they hope for, as they walked through the ritual of their own public unmaking? They were not all the same. Some were young, barely into their 20s, having married men chosen by family or circumstance. Others were older, wives for decades, now cast aside or walking away from bitterness that had fermented over the years. A few had children. Most did not bring them to the sale. Some women had agreed to it. They had helped plan it. They had chosen the buyer, a lover, a neighbor, a man who had promised something gentler. For them, the rope was not just a tether, but a signal of transition. It was not marriage. It was not freedom. But it was a movement, a breath. Others were not so willing. They had argued, pleaded. Some had cried. And in the end, when the rope was tied, they knew resistance would only make things worse. The law would not protect them. Their families would not shelter them. And so they stood, not consenting, but yielding. What unites them all is the weight of the silence they carried. A woman sold in the marketplace did not speak of it later. She did not tell the story to her children, or recount it with pride. Even those who found peace afterward rarely looked back. The moment was not history to them. It was something to be outlived. Some women walked away into better homes. The buyer was kind. He offered a bed, food, the dignity of listening. These stories are rare, but they exist. And in them we glimpse the barest outlines of agency. A woman maneuvering within a narrow, suffocating world to make something more bearable of her life. Others walked into hardship. The buyer turned cold, or drunk, or cruel. The crowd's approval did not guarantee safety. There was no recourse, no returning to the first husband, no legal support. These women often faded into shadows, names on census rolls, servants in other households, absences in their children's lives. What did it feel like that first night? To lie in a new room, in a new house, the memory of the rope still burning on the skin? Some women wrote letters. Fragments survive. One writes of, "The shame still in my mouth." Another of, "Having no name for what I now am." It was not widowhood. Not divorce. It was something stranger. Society had no clear language for them. They were not quite wives, nor mistresses, nor single women. They were women in transition, socially divorced but legally bound. In some towns, they were treated kindly. In others, with suspicion. Much depended on the man who now owned them, and how he behaved. A few rebelled quietly. They refused to take the buyer's name. They kept to themselves, never remarrying, never returning. Some found work, others disappeared into larger towns. One woman, sold in a Yorkshire village in 1839, later became a healer on the outskirts of Leeds. Locals called her the Market Witch. She wore no ring. It is tempting to imagine them as symbols of suffering, of resistance, of silent endurance. But they were people. Ordinary, complex, frightened, sometimes defiant. Not heroines. Not martyrs. Just women trying to breathe within a world that left them little air. And yet, even within this darkness, there were flickers of connection. A woman might find companionship with other outcast wives. In certain communities, a kind of solidarity formed, unspoken, cautious, but real. Women who had stood on the same cobbles did not judge each other. They recognized the look in the eye. Children made things harder. If they were left behind, the woman carried a permanent grief. If they were brought along, The new man often grew resentful. The rope around her wrist might have vanished, but another had taken its place: obligation, guilt, survival. There were moments, too, when women walked away and found no one waiting. No buyer stepped forward. No hand reached for the rope. In those cases, they became untethered entirely. These women often fled, to cities, to distant relatives, to places where no one knew their names or how they had been discarded. And always, there was the memory of the crowd. Of standing still while others stared. Of laughter and whispers. Of shame blooming beneath the skin. Some women could never return to their villages. Others did, holding their heads high, daring anyone to speak. They were not victims in the way stories often frame them. Nor were they free. They lived in a liminal state, between ownership and abandonment, between past and present. And in that space, they found small ways to survive. It matters that we tell their stories. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are ordinary. And in history, it is the ordinary lives that reveal the most, not the laws, not the leaders, but the quiet resilience of those forced to walk paths they never chose. So when we speak of wife sales, let us not imagine only the men and the coins and the rope. Let us remember the women who walked away, who kept walking, who made something out of the ruins handed to them in public, in daylight, before the eyes of the world. The price was rarely high. A shilling. A pint of beer. Sometimes, just a handshake and a promise to never return. At first glance, these transactions seem laughable, absurd in their simplicity. But look a little closer, and they become something else entirely: windows into a world where worth was whispered, not declared. When a woman was sold in the marketplace, the question of price hovered over the moment like fog. Not because anyone expected a proper value to be assigned, but because society needed some small symbol, some coin or object, to turn the unthinkable into transaction. Without a price, it would have been too honest, too raw, too true. Most wife sales were not about money. They were about release. Release from a marriage that could not be legally ended. Release from burdens no court would lift. Release from a system that had no language for marital failure. But still, something had to change hands. A token. A gesture. Something to make the crowd nod. The most common exchange was a coin. A single shilling or sixpence. Just enough to say, "A deal has been struck." It was not the money itself that mattered. It was the act of exchange, the way it mimicked legal purchase, the way it soothed the crowd's discomfort. A coin made the sale feel proper, even if everyone knew it wasn't. Then there were the sales made for ale. These were more theatrical: 2 mugs raised, a clink of pottery, the smell of yeast and wood smoke. The ale acted as a kind of ritual drink, shared by seller and buyer, a toast to the strange transfer of one human life from another. It was never about thirst. It was about tradition. Other trades were more symbolic. A dog. A sheep. A loaf of bread. In one recorded case, a man sold his wife for a greyhound and a saddle. In another, the exchange was for a meal and continued good friendship. These transactions weren't bartering. They were stories, small performances meant to reframe humiliation as something else. Why were the prices so low? Because high prices would have implied seriousness. They would have made the act too real. Selling your wife for £10 might suggest value. Selling her for a pint of ale suggested desperation, absurdity, or both. It reduced the woman not to property, but to symbol, which, in its own way, was more damaging. There's a haunting contradiction here. On one hand, the woman was treated as property. On the other, she was given away for almost nothing. It sent a strange, cruel message: you belong to me, and yet you are worth nearly nothing at all. It was not just about release. It was about devaluation. Some sellers likely thought the cheap price protected them, made the act a joke, distanced them from guilt. "I didn't really sell her," one might say. "It was just for show." But the woman still stood with the rope. The crowd still watched. The shame, regardless of the price, was the same. And what of the buyers? Did the price matter to them? Sometimes, a man might refuse to pay for a wife, insisting he was taking on responsibility, not making a purchase. Others preferred a token price, something to seal the ritual. And a few saw it as a bargain, the cheapest acquisition of a domestic partner one could imagine. The wife, of course, had no control over the amount. She might be sold for a coin, or a dog, or a promise whispered behind the tavern. And yet, years later, that price would be remembered, retold by neighbors, passed down as legend. She was sold for a shilling. He gave her away for a drink. These prices became their history. In some cases, women demanded to be sold for nothing. They refused the exchange of goods, insisting that their departure not be measured in coins or cattle. These women often faced even harsher gossip, accused of scandal, selfishness, or madness. A price, even a small one, gave the act structure. Without it, society flailed. There's a cold brilliance to the symbolic pricing. It allowed communities to keep the ritual going without confronting its horror. The absurdity of the payment, the dog, the ale, the single coin, distracted from the core reality, that a woman's fate was being decided in public, with no recourse, no protection, and no honor. This practice was not limited to one town or one decade. Reports of symbolic prices appear across England, from the 17th through the 19th centuries. The details shift, the clothing, the accents, the marketplaces, but the structure remains. A man, a woman, a crowd, and something trivial exchanged. Even newspapers, when they mentioned the price, did so with a wink. Sold for a quart of ale and a new pipe, one paper wrote. The headline was humorous. The article brief. The woman's name, if listed, appeared once, and was forgotten. But the price? That was remembered. We must ask ourselves, what was the emotional cost of these symbolic prices? What does it do to a person to know they were traded for something that could be swallowed in minutes, or leashed at the ankle, or forgotten at the bottom of a coat pocket? This was not just humiliation. It was erasure. And yet these same tokens, the coin, the ale, the dog, became strange artifacts of resistance. Women who later escaped abusive husbands might retell their own sale as a liberation. "He sold me for a jug," one woman recalled. "And it was the best deal I ever saw made." In their mouths, the absurdity became weapon. In the end, the price was never about value. It was about control. About narrative. About creating the illusion that what was happening had rules, even if those rules were invented on the spot. It made the crowd feel safer. It made the seller feel justified. And it made the woman disappear. But history remembers these numbers. The shillings. The jugs. The dogs. They remain in archives scratched onto court papers and gossip columns. They are not proof of justice. But they are proof of what people were willing to believe, and how little it sometimes took to convince them. The crowd gathered to watch a woman be sold. Some laughed. Others shifted their feet in discomfort. But not many noticed the child clinging to her skirts, small, silent, eyes wide with confusion. He would not cry. Not yet. Not until later, when it was too late, when she was gone. We rarely speak of them, the children of wife sales. But they were there, always, just out of sight. In arms, at the edge of the market, peering from behind barrels or leaning against carts. Their presence was not central to the ritual, but it haunted every part of it. For them, the moment was not a curiosity or a spectacle. It was the end of something essential. What did a child see when his mother was sold? Not legality, not ritual, not relief, but separation. One day, she was there. The next, she was led away. Perhaps she kissed him. Perhaps she didn't. Perhaps the rope was tied loosely. Perhaps she stumbled. Either way, the child was left behind. Sometimes, the child stayed with the father. In those cases, the story that followed was often practical, almost businesslike. She went away, they were told. She was no longer part of the house. "She's gone," the father might say, and that was all. The details were left to rumor. But the ache lingered. Children do not forget absence, even when adults pretend otherwise. A missing mother becomes a ghost that walks the halls. Her voice remains in memory, her warmth in linens and soup spoons. The loss is not loud. It is quiet and steady. It settles deep. Other children went with their mothers. These transitions were hard, too. They often meant entering a new home, calling a new man uncle, or sir, sensing the unspoken strain in every meal. The child knew, somehow, that this new life was not built on stability, but on a strange, unwritten contract. In some cases, either parent kept the child. A grandmother stepped in. An older sibling. A workhouse. For these children, wife's sales led to exile, not just of family, but of identity. They became unmoored, referred to by others as the boy whose mother was sold, or the girl whose father traded a wife for ale. Teachers noticed changes. Some children grew quiet, others unruly. A few acted as though nothing had changed at all, but that too was a sign. The absence became a bruise beneath their daily lives. And though it was rarely spoken of, it colored everything: their trust, their sense of safety, their understanding of love. What stories did they tell themselves? That she had gone by choice? That she had been taken? That something terrible had happened? Each child invented their own logic. Few were told the truth. Even fewer had anyone to talk to about it. Wife sales were not discussed in polite society. And children, especially, were meant to stay silent. And yet they remembered. Decades later, grown men and women would write letters, to newspapers, to friends, to themselves, recounting the day their mother vanished. "I saw her standing by the pump with a rope around her waist," one man wrote. "I was 7. I did not understand. I never asked." The emotional cost was profound. For some, it manifested as anger. They blamed their fathers, or the man who bought her, or society at large. For others, it became guilt. "I should have done something," they thought, even if they had been no older than 5 or 6. Children do not yet know the limits of their power. Girls were especially vulnerable. If they stayed with their father, they sometimes became caretakers, stepping into their mother's role far too early. If they went with their mother, they were judged harshly by neighbors. Their future marriages, reputations, and friendships were shaped by the shadow of that sale. And yet, despite all this, life continued. Children adapted because they had to. They learned not to ask questions. They grew up and made choices of their own, some vowing never to marry, others rushing into unions for fear of being left behind. The trauma did not always destroy them, but it always marked them. We often imagine children as resilient, and they are. But resilience is not the absence of pain. It is survival in its presence. The children of wife sales carried invisible burdens, questions without answers, loyalties torn in two, homes reshaped overnight. And most carried it in silence. There were exceptions. In some communities, aunts or cousins offered comfort. In rare cases, clergy intervened, not to stop the sale, but to help the child afterward. These acts of kindness mattered. They softened the wound, even if they could not heal it. One story survives of a child who, at age 9, followed his mother after the sale. Refused to return home. He lived with her and her new husband until adulthood, then cared for her in old age. "I was sold too," he once said. "But I stayed with her." A small act of love, carved from a cruel tradition. Such moments are rare. More often, the child was left behind, standing in the square or curled in a doorway, the crowd dispersing around them. No rope on their wrist. No price on their head. But sold, in a way, all the same. We cannot know how many children were shaped by this. The records do not say. The newspapers do not count them. But their presence lingers, in stories passed down, in the careful hush of families who do not talk about the past, in the way loss echoes down generations. So when we think of wife selling, let us not imagine only the man, the woman, the buyer, and the crowd. Let us picture the small figure at the edge, watching, waiting, wondering. Because history, though often told by adults, is felt most deeply by the children who were never given a choice. There were no posters, no church bells or proclamations. And yet, word always spread. By morning, the town knew. By midday, the curious had gathered. By afternoon, the square was full. Not for punishment, not for celebration, but for a sale of a woman, by her husband, beneath the sky they all shared. It was not London, not York, not the grand cities with towers and laws on paper. No, most of these sales happened in smaller places. Market towns. Villages. Hamlets where everyone knew everyone else, by name, by face, by the pitch of their cough in the winter fog. And that knowing made the watching worse. They were not strangers. The people who gathered were neighbors, bakers, clerks, girls who fetched water at the same pump, boys who had played in her garden when they were small. They were not unfamiliar. They were familiar, and somehow that made the silence heavier. The wife's sale became a kind of ritual in these places. Not frequent, but expected. Not praised, but permitted. It was not law, but it was lore. Every town had a story. The woman sold outside the tavern, the one who ran, the one who refused to cry. And those stories passed down like recipes, altered, repeated, half-remembered. Some towns treated it as entertainment. The men leaned on their elbows, the women whispered, children ran underfoot. A man with a drum might appear, or a fiddler, turning the moment into something festive. The discomfort was drowned out by sound. Noise could cover anything. Other towns grew solemn. The ritual played out without comment, the exchange made in near silence. But even here, the watching continued, not loud, not cruel, but constant. The stillness became its own kind of violence, as if everyone agreed not to speak but also not to stop. Shops remained open. Bread was sold. The blacksmith kept working. And yet, there in the center of it all, a woman was being sold like a mule. And no one stopped. Because in many places, this was not strange. It was just what happened. The locations were often the same, outside the inn, near the livestock pens, beside the market cross. Spaces that were public enough to be witnessed, but ordinary enough to be forgotten. No monuments. No markers. The towns chose places that could be rinsed of memory by the next day's rain. And then there were the participants. The auctioneer, usually the husband himself. The buyer, often already known to the crowd. And the woman, standing still, trying to disappear. But the townspeople? They were the chorus. The background. The eyes. They gave the moment its meaning. Without the crowd, the ritual collapsed. It was their presence that turned an ugly decision into a shared story. And in that shared story, a kind of complicity grew. No one stopped it. Because everyone saw it. This was not passive. Some people cheered. Others laughed. A few made cruel jokes. But even those who said nothing were part of it. Silence is not neutral when harm is being done. And in many of these towns, silence was the chosen language. Still, not all watched with indifference. There are records, quiet, rare, fragile, of protest. A woman who threw a stone at the husband. A priest who stood in the way. A group of mothers who turned their backs. But these were exceptions, and they came with risk. Speaking out meant being seen. And being seen meant trouble. The towns had long memories, but short sympathies. A woman who refused the rope might be labeled ungrateful, a troublemaker. A buyer who stepped back might be mocked. To challenge the ritual was to disturb the uneasy balance of village life. And so, the towns adapted. They made room for the ritual. Some places created their own variations, adding bells, or a particular phrase, or a specific corner where the sale would occur. In this way, they made the practice feel local, like something theirs. Not a stain, but a tradition. Over time, this familiarity hardened into normalcy. When people grew up watching it, they learned not to flinch. Children who saw their first wife's sale at 6 would see their second at 10 and barely look. By adulthood, it was background noise, like the butcher's shout or the sound of the well chain. Even when the outside world began to condemn the practice, many towns resisted. "We've always done it this way," they said. And they had. Which is precisely why it took so long to stop. Because a law can be passed in a day. But a town's habits? They take generations. They grow roots. They wrap around buildings and language and laughter. They become part of who people think they are. And in many towns, wife selling was part of that identity, not officially, not proudly, but deeply. It lived in the corners of conversation, in the way people looked away, in the stories half told over pints. Everyone knew. And no one said? These were the towns that watched. Not cruel towns. Not monstrous towns. Just ordinary ones, with cobbled streets and flower stalls and families who believed that as long as it wasn't happening to them, it wasn't happening at all. History often asks us to judge. But here, perhaps, it asks us only to notice. To notice how harm survives not just through force, but through familiarity. Not just through cruelty, but through routine. The towns that watched remind us, silence is not always peace. Sometimes it's permission. It is a phrase you will come across again and again, in letters, in old newspapers, in casual retellings of the past. She agreed to it. Or more plainly, she wanted to be sold. Spoken with a shrug, a dismissive smile, or even pride. As if that made it better. The myth of consent is one of the strangest and most enduring elements of wife selling. Even in modern accounts, there is a quiet insistence that many women were willing participants. That they saw the rope, stepped into it, and walked forward of their own free will. But what does that really mean? Consent is not a word that lives in a vacuum. It is shaped by pressure, by options, by the risks of refusal. To say someone agreed, without looking at what they stood to lose is not to describe consent, it is to erase context. Most of the women who agreed were not offered real choices. There were no divorce courts for the poor. No shelters. No advocates. If a husband decided he wanted to be rid of his wife, or if she desperately needed to leave, the rope and the market were sometimes the only way. And so yes, some of them agreed. But it was the kind of agreement that grows in shadows. That says, if I stay, I will suffer. If I go, I will be shamed. But maybe shame is lighter than bruises. That is not consent. That is survival. In some cases, the sale was even presented as a favor. The husband would tell neighbors, "She wants this. I'm doing her a kindness." And perhaps she had said those words, under duress, after threats, with no coin in her pocket and no roof to sleep beneath. Consent extracted under pressure is not consent at all. There were, certainly, moments of strategy. A woman might plan her own exit, identify a man she trusted, agree to a public sale as a way of protecting herself from worse harm behind closed doors. But even in these cases, she was not choosing from freedom. She was choosing from fear. Why does the myth persist? Because it comforts us. It allows us to believe that something shameful was actually sensible. That it was all arranged, clean, mutual. That no one suffered more than they wanted to. But the historical truth is rarely that tidy. There are no records, none, of women organizing wife sales purely for drama or humor. No diaries celebrating the event. No letters describing it with pride. The tone is always quiet, if it is mentioned at all. Often, it is not mentioned. The silence itself tells us everything. And yet, society has always found ways to reinterpret that silence. When a woman did not cry, she was said to be happy. When she did not run, she was said to be content. When she stood still, people called it choice. But stillness is not always consent. Sometimes it is learned helplessness. Newspapers added to the confusion. They described the scenes with detachment, or with humor. A most agreeable exchange, one paper noted. Another called the woman Mary. But we have no record of asking her. Her voice was never printed. Men repeated the story of consent because it flattered them. She wanted it, they could say. She smiled. But smiles, too, can be armor. And wanting something different is not the same as wanting what was offered. Communities found safety in the myth as well. If the woman wanted it, then no one had to intervene. No one had to feel guilty. No one had to challenge the structure that allowed her to be sold in the first place. Consent, even imagined, became a shield for everyone else. There's another layer, too, one harder to name. Some people liked the story of willing women because it added spice. It made the ritual seem strange and alluring, even romantic. The idea of a woman stepping forward into her own sale gave the event the sheen of drama, not suffering. But the human truth beneath that story is often far more fragile. A woman agreeing to a sale was not announcing empowerment. She was enduring. She was navigating a system that offered no safe exits. She was choosing what harm she might survive. This does not mean every woman was miserable. Some found better homes. Some found tenderness. But even when the outcome was kind, the structure was not. The ritual was not designed for their dignity. It was designed for their disposal. And so the myth lingers, in books, in television, even in casual conversation. Back then, someone might say, women didn't mind so much. But if you look at the photographs, those few that survive, if you study the faces, the posture, the eyes, you will see otherwise. There is weariness. There is tension. There is quiet grief. And most of all, there is the absence of celebration. These are not brides. These are not victors. These are women walking through a process designed to erase them. And even when they agreed, it did not mean they were free. Consent, real consent, requires power. It requires options. It requires safety. Without those, what we call consent is often just endurance, the decision to suffer slightly less, because more was never on offer. The law is often thought of as a great shield, a structure designed to protect the weak, correct injustice, and bring order to a disordered world. But for more than a century in England, the law stood still while women were sold in broad daylight. Not because it didn't know, but because it chose not to see. There was no specific statute permitting wife selling. No legal document that laid out the terms of transfer or formalized the marketplace ritual. And yet, the absence of law became a kind of law itself. What is tolerated long enough begins to feel legitimate, even to those who ought to know better. In taverns and town squares, men tied ropes around their wives and led them to market. Crowds gathered. Coins changed hands. And police officers, judges, magistrates, they passed by, said nothing, or even watched. Not always approving, but rarely intervening. Why? Because the law had no clear answer. Divorce, in that period, was nearly impossible for the poor. It required a private act of parliament, costly, slow, and designed for the wealthy. For everyone else, marriage was a locked door, and wife selling, however absurd, was one of the only visible exits. So the courts averted their gaze. When a case arose, when someone challenged a sale, or a conflict broke out, the results were inconsistent. Some judges condemned the practice as illegal. Others waved it off as custom. Still others ridiculed the participants, treating the whole thing as comedic mischief. In this confusion, ambiguity became permission. Local officials, uncertain whether they had grounds to act, often chose inaction. Better to do nothing than to upset tradition. Better to mock than to prosecute. And in that refusal, wife selling flourished. The newspapers helped blur the lines. They reported the sales with wit, not outrage. A rustic ceremony, one paper called it. A singular method of separation, said another. Few asked why the law did not step in. Fewer still asked if it should. There were attempts, here and there, to impose control. A magistrate might fine a husband for causing a public disturbance. A constable might break up a crowd. But these responses focused on decorum, not dignity. The issue was rarely that a woman had been sold. It was that the sale had been too noisy. Legal scholars debated the matter in pamphlets and journals. Some argued that wife sales had no standing and should be stamped out. Others saw them as an informal social contract, a workaround in a system that offered no humane alternatives. But theory rarely reached the women in the market. For them, the law was not a presence. It was an absence, a silence, an empty bench. They were not seen as individuals with rights, but as appendages of their husbands, to be handed over, traded, discarded. And in that silence, the rope tightened. Even when laws against cruelty or disorderly conduct were cited, enforcement was erratic. Officers did not want to be laughed at. Judges did not want to be flooded with cases they couldn't resolve. And so, sale after sale continued, in view of the law, but never quite within its grasp. This inaction had consequences. It told communities that wife selling, while strange, was not forbidden. It told husbands that their desperation would be met with winks, not handcuffs. And it told women that they were on their own. Occasionally, Parliament would discuss the matter. A member might raise the issue, prompted by a particularly scandalous case. But the topic rarely lasted more than a few minutes. It is not widespread, they said. It is exaggerated. And the moment passed. But the numbers do not lie. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of documented sales, and countless more unrecorded. Town after town, rope after rope. And each one a quiet indictment of the institutions that failed to act. Law, of course, is often slow. But in this case, it was willfully blind. The authorities understood the symbolism. They knew what it meant for a woman to be sold like livestock. But they also knew that stepping in would mean addressing poverty, marriage, and gender all at once. And so, they stepped aside. The rare cases where law did intervene are telling. A husband punished for drunkenness, not for the sale. A buyer fined for disrupting public order, not for purchasing a human being. The system found ways to speak, but never about what truly mattered. This silence became habit. Over time, officials stopped seeing wife selling as a legal concern. It became a cultural one, left to communities to manage. And communities, as we know, are not always kind. By the mid-19th century, as social reforms began to gather momentum, the tide began to shift. The law, slowly, cautiously, began to condemn the practice outright. But even then, there was no sweeping legislation. No great reckoning. Just a quiet disappearance from public spaces. The final recorded sales did not end in arrest. They ended in embarrassment. In social scorn. In whispers. The law had waited too long to be bold. And by the time it spoke, its words rang hollow. Today, we often look back and ask, how could it have happened? Why did no one stop it? The answer lies not in cruelty, but in cowardice. The law did not endorse wife selling. But it feared what stopping it might require, real change. And so, the women were left alone. Bound by rope. Watched by neighbors. Ignored by courts. Not forgotten, but never defended. The law looked away. And history remembers. No bells rang. No laws thundered down. No angry crowds stormed the squares. When wife selling in England finally came to an end, it did not collapse beneath outrage or revolution. It simply faded. Like mist at dawn. Like breath on glass. There is a common belief that wrongs are always righted loudly, that injustice is defeated by moral clarity, by brave speeches and bold acts. But the truth, more often, is that wrongs disappear because the world shifts its gaze. Because people get tired of the spectacle. Because silence, at long last, becomes awkward. By the mid-1800s, wife selling was no longer novel. It was outdated. Old-fashioned. Embarrassing. Not because it had grown more cruel, but because society had begun to imagine itself more modern. The Industrial Revolution had changed the fabric of English life. Towns swelled. Trains arrived. People who had once known everyone on their street now shared sidewalks with strangers. And in that anonymity, old rituals began to look strange. Out of place. The rise of the Victorian moral order, with its rigid codes of decency, its obsession with respectability, also played a role. What once passed as earthy and practical now seemed shameful. A rope around a woman's waist was no longer rustic. It was crude. Newspapers that once chuckled over wife sales began to frown. Editors called them relics. Writers described them as sad vestiges of an ignorant age. Not necessarily wrong, but behind the sneer was something quieter, a desire to move on, to pretend it had never really happened. This shift in attitude did more than any court ruling. As the laughter died down, so did the practice. Without the crowd's energy, without the market's complicity, the ritual lost its teeth. A sale needs witnesses. And fewer people wanted to be seen watching. Education helped too. As literacy spread, people read about the practice in books, not as folklore, but as disgrace. Teachers warned children that it was barbaric. Ministers spoke of it from pulpits. And while their words were not always filled with empathy, they did draw a line. Quietly, towns that had once tolerated wife-selling began to ban it unofficially. Not through laws, but through shame. A husband who tried might be refused at the tavern. A buyer might be laughed at instead of welcomed. The crowd, once complicit, became uncomfortable. In some cases, the authorities finally stepped in, not with handcuffs, but with muttered warnings. A constable would advise the man to go home. A magistrate would scold rather than fine. Not justice, exactly, but a nudge toward disappearance. The last known sales trickled into the newspapers in the late 19th century. Each one smaller than the last. A man in Yorkshire sold his wife for a few shillings in 1881. Another in London tried the same in 1893. But the coverage was different now, colder, more judgmental. The tone had changed. And then it stopped. Not all at once, but gradually. A trickle became silence. No one can say with certainty which was the very last wife sale in England. There is no plaque. No ceremony. Just the vanishing of a tradition too long tolerated. But silence does not mean forgetting. In some families, the stories were passed down, whispered across generations. Your great-grandmother, someone might say, was sold at market. She walked away with a baby in her arms and a scarf around her shoulders. In others, the memory was buried, hidden in euphemism or shame. They separated, a family might say. Or, she left him. The rope disappeared from the story. The market faded into the background. Historians took up the work next. Not loudly, not urgently, but with care. They sifted through newspapers, court records, parish notes. They pieced together the lives behind the sales. And what they found was not scandal. It was sorrow. The women were not monsters or martyrs. They were not symbols. They were human, navigating desperation with what little dignity they could. And the communities that watched them were not villains. They were simply unwilling to see what was in front of them. That is how the story ended. Not with justice. Not with closure. But with time. Time wore the edges smooth. Time turned ridicule into discomfort, discomfort into forgetfulness. And so wife-selling ended the way it lived, in public, but unacknowledged. There is something haunting about that. We want neat endings. We want wrongs to be punished and rituals to be abolished by law. But sometimes, the ending comes more softly. Like footsteps fading down a hallway. Like a door that is never quite shut, but no longer opens. Even today, there are those who hear the story of wife-selling and laugh. They find it unbelievable. Absurd. And perhaps that is the final cruelty, that something so painful could be remembered as a curiosity, a punchline, a bit of weird old history. But if you listen closely to the silence that followed, you can still hear the truth. It was not just a practice. It was a wound. And when it ended, there was no healing, only quiet. Not all stories end with the sale. In fact, most of them don't. After the crowd drifted away and the rope was removed, the woman was still there, standing in the same clothes, under the same sky, with a new man by her side and an old name behind her. That's where the real story began. Some women left the market in silence. They walked home, or to another home, with their heads down and their steps careful. Others were led. Not forcefully, but without choice. Few walked alone. Few chose the direction. There were husbands who sold their wives out of cruelty. Others did it out of poverty. Some claimed it was mutual, even generous. But whatever the reason, the women were the ones who had to carry the weight. They were the ones who had to rebuild, or at least pretend to. What did they leave behind? A reputation. A name. A version of themselves that would never be quite whole again. In villages where everyone knew everything, there was no erasing what had happened. The sale became part of their identity. Not chosen. Just attached. For some, the change meant survival. If the new man was kinder, if the new home was safer, there was a kind of quiet relief. Not joy, exactly. But the absence of fear can feel like happiness when fear is all you've known. Children were often caught in the middle. A woman might be sold with her child, or leave her child behind. There are records of both. And no one wrote down how that felt, not in letters, not in ledgers. We are left only with gaps. Many of these women became invisible after the sale. They vanished into other households, melted into other families. The system didn't follow them. There was no paperwork, no state acknowledgement. Only neighbors, watching, whispering, remembering. And yet some traces remain. Census records with scratched out surnames. Baptism registers where the same woman is listed under two different men. These quiet clues are all we have, breadcrumbs scattered across decades of silence. The emotional toll is harder to measure. Shame settles deep in the bones. So does bitterness. Some women may have found peace. Others, we know, did not. There are court cases, years later, where women who had once been sold returned, angry, defiant, demanding recognition. Their words are clipped, legal. But underneath, a wound. There are hints of pride, too. In rare oral histories, descendants speak of grandmothers who refused to be quiet, who told their stories without blinking. "Yes, I was sold," one woman reportedly said. "And I lived longer than both of them." These are moments of resistance, small, personal, but real. The sale may have marked them, but it did not always define them. They became wives again. Mothers. Workers. Survivors. They moved forward, carrying what they had to carry. And what they carried was not just shame. It was memory. Of a rope. Of eyes. Of the sound of coins. These memories were not always spoken, but they were passed down, in gestures, in silences, in the way a woman might look away when asked about the past. What they left behind, too, was a caution. A story not to be repeated. In families where a woman had been sold, there was often a hunger for something better. For stability. For law. For respect. The trauma became fuel. Society slowly caught up. Laws were reformed. Divorce became possible, then more common. Education widened. Women gained the right to own property, to speak in courts, to refuse. But these victories did not erase the past. They only rose from it. Some historians argue that the legacy of wife selling helped push these changes, that the discomfort it created in the public eye made room for reform. If that's true, then the women who were sold left behind more than just silence. They left a crack in the wall, a crack through which light entered. And yet, we rarely remember them by name. Their stories are buried in footnotes, their faces unphotographed. The husbands are sometimes remembered, the bold ones, the drunk ones, the men with clever jokes. But the women? They remained shadowed. What they left behind, most of all, was a question. A quiet question that history still hasn't answered. What is the value of a woman's voice, if no one records it? What is the measure of her dignity, if her sale is a public event and her grief is private? There is no monument for these women. No official apology. No national day of mourning. But perhaps, in remembering, gently, quietly, we begin to give them what they were once denied, a space. A voice. A place in the story. And that might be enough. Or at least, it might be a start. It would be easy to forget. To close the book, end the video, and say, that was then. A strange chapter in a strange time. A ritual long dead. A problem resolved. And yet, something about this story lingers, soft as smoke, sharp as memory. Because this was not ancient. This was not medieval. The last wife sales happened in the age of telegrams and trains. In the same century that gave us photography and steamships and parliamentary debate. Not long ago at all. And more than that, it wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. These women were sold in public. Watched. Laughed at. Documented. And still, the world moved on. That is why the story matters. Because it reminds us how easy it is to see cruelty and do nothing. Wife selling is not just a historical oddity. It is a case study in collective indifference. A reminder that injustice can wear familiar clothes. That when something happens often enough, people stop calling it wrong. They just call it normal. And there, perhaps, is the real warning. We imagine ourselves more evolved, more aware. But what customs today will one day seem unthinkable? What quiet harms do we walk past because they don't look like violence? The past does not accuse us. It invites us to see, to reflect, to ask better questions. The women who were sold, not all of them wanted pity. But many, if they could speak, might ask for understanding. Might ask not to be remembered as curiosities, but as people. There's also a risk in how we tell these stories. In the retelling, we sometimes smooth over the pain. We say, well, at least some of them found better lives. Or, it wasn't as bad as slavery. But suffering does not need to compete to be real. Wife selling did not happen despite community approval. It happened because of it. That should unsettle us. It means the line between custom and cruelty is thinner than we like to think. It means tradition is not always a shield, sometimes it's a mask. When we look at those towns, those markets, those onlookers, we see not monsters, but ordinary people. People like us. That is what stings. And what saves us, perhaps, is how we choose to respond to that recognition. History becomes dangerous only when we believe it has no bearing on today. But if we let it sit beside us, quietly, patiently, it becomes something else. A kind of companion. A whisper of, be careful. A shadow reminding us where the light should fall. The story of wife selling shows us what happens when voices are ignored. When systems fail. When dignity is traded for convenience. And it shows us, too, how slowly justice moves. How often it arrives too late to help the people who needed it most. But it also leaves room for tenderness. For seeing those women not just as victims, but as whole. As brave, even when afraid. As enduring, even when forgotten. Their stories didn't end with the rope. Neither should our telling of them. Today, no woman in England can be legally sold. That is progress. But silence still exists. Still, in places where voices are small, and systems are loud. Still, in corners where customs blur into control. That's why we look back, not to scold, but to see. To remind ourselves that history is not finished. That the shape of injustice changes, but its heartbeat remains familiar. And that sometimes, the smallest acts, noticing, remembering, saying the quiet part aloud, are the first steps towards something better. What matters most is not that wife selling happened. It's that it was accepted. And then, eventually, quietly, it wasn't. Somewhere, someone said no. Someone turned away. Someone chose dignity over laughter. That turning point matters. Because that is where change begins. Not in laws, always, but in discomfort. In the moment a tradition begins to feel wrong. In the breathe before someone speaks. We remember wife selling not because we want to stare at the strangeness, but because we recognize its shape. And in that recognition, we might learn to recognize other harms, quieter, modern, equally real. That is why this history still matters. Not for what it says about them, but for what it asks of us. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. A story not just about markets and ropes, but about silence. About what happens when society looks away. Wife selling may be gone, but the way it was accepted, ignored, and later forgotten, still echoes. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. These quiet corners of history matter, and I'm glad we could explore this one together. I'd love to know what time it is where you are, and where you're listening from. Leave a comment below, I read everyone. And if you'd like more stories like this, soft, strange, and grounded in forgotten truth, consider subscribing. For now, close your eyes, let the past drift, and rest well.